The dust of the high plains was a language Caleb Thorne understood. It spoke of rain or drought, of the changing seasons, of the simple, unyielding contract between a man and his land. For 8 years, that dust had settled on the back of his horse, Thunder, a fine, reddish coat that mirrored the soil from which Caleb had built his life. Their bond was older than the ranch house, deeper than the well he dug with his own hands. It was a partnership forged in silent sunrises and the shared exhaustion of dusks that bled purple and orange across the vast, lonely sky. Thunder was more than livestock. He was a metronome for Caleb's existence, a steady 4-beat rhythm against the earth that meant everything was as it should be. Their routine was a prayer spoken not with words, but with the familiar creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle, the soft nicker of greeting in the cool morning air. It was a life of straight lines, fence lines, property lines, the line between work and rest. There was no room for deviation, no place for the inexplicable. Until today. The sun was a searing white coin in the cerulean expanse, and the air hummed with the lazy drone of late summer insects. It was time to bring the horses in from the far pasture, a task as regular as breathing. But as Caleb led Thunder toward the stable, the solid, pine-scented heart of the ranch, a structure he had raised himself, plank by plank, nail by nail, the rhythm broke. 20 yards from the wide-open doors, Thunder stopped dead. His neck arched, muscles coiling into stone beneath Caleb's hand. It wasn't a stubborn halt or a playful refusal. It was a planting of hooves, a rooting to the spot as if the ground before him had turned to fire. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. He gave the lead rope a gentle tug. "Come on, it's just the barn." Thunder didn't budge. Instead, he took a shuffling step backward, his head high, nostrils flaring wide to taste a threat Caleb could not perceive. A tremor ran through the horse's massive frame, a deep, cellular shudder that traveled up the rope and into Caleb's arm. He'd felt the horse spook at snakes, shy from the sudden flight of a quail, but this was different. This was not a reaction to a stimulus. This was a primal, absolute rejection of a place that should have been a sanctuary. His eyes, normally a soft, intelligent brown, were wide with white, fixed on the dark maw of the stable entrance. A low, guttural snort ripped from his chest, a sound of pure terror. Caleb's brow furrowed. He let the rope go slack and walked a slow circle around the animal, his gaze sweeping the ground. No rattlesnakes, no predators. He sniffed the air. It smelled of hay, dust, and the familiar, comforting scent of horse. He walked to the stable doors and peered inside. The late afternoon light slanted through the gaps in the siding, illuminating dancing dust motes in the familiar space. The other stalls were empty, awaiting their occupants. The air was still, thick with the peace of a job well done. There was nothing. "See? Nothing in there, you big fool," Caleb said, his voice laced with a confusion that was beginning to curdle into concern. He walked back and took the rope again, this time with more authority. "All right, that's enough. Let's go." He pulled. Thunder resisted, his iron-shod hooves scraping grooves in the hard-packed earth. The horse tossed his head, a violent, panicked motion, and backed away so sharply that Caleb had to let go or be dragged. The animal retreated another 10 feet, his breath coming in ragged, whistling bursts. He stood there, quivering, his entire being focused on the barn as if it were a living predator about to spring. For 8 years, this horse had followed him into canyons, across riverbeds, and through blinding blizzards. For 8 years, the stable had been the reward at the end of every day, a place of food, water, and rest. And now, it was a source of unspeakable fear. The straight lines of Caleb's world had just begun to bend, and in the unnerving silence, he felt the first cold prickle of an unease that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the solid ground beneath his feet. The foundation of his reality was shifting, and his most trusted companion was the first to feel the tremor. The standoff bled from minutes into the better part of an hour. The sun dipped lower, painting the undersides of the few wispy clouds in strokes of violent pink. Caleb tried everything. He tried coaxing with a bucket of oats, a bribe Thunder had never once refused. The horse would stretch his neck, his nostrils twitching, but the moment the scent of the grain mingled with whatever emanated from the stable, he would recoil as if struck. Caleb tried walking one of the other, more placid mares, Daisy, towards the entrance. She went willingly enough until she reached the same invisible threshold that had stopped Thunder. She too halted, her ears twitching nervously. She wasn't terrified, not in the soul-deep way Thunder was, but she was deeply reluctant, her muscles tense and her eyes wary. She let out a low whinny of protest and allowed Caleb to lead her away without a fight, casting anxious glances back at the shadowed doorway. The commotion, the sheer abnormality of it, was a disturbance in the quiet fabric of the valley. A plume of dust on the access road announced the arrival of Henrik's old pickup truck. Henrik was his closest neighbor, a man whose face was a road map of 70-odd years spent under the Wyoming sun. He pulled up, killed the engine, and leaned his arm out the window, his expression quizzical. "Trouble, Caleb," he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. Caleb walked over, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He felt foolish, unable to control his own animal on his own land. "Can't get him in the stable," he said, gesturing with his thumb towards the trembling horse. "Thunder. Just planted himself and won't move. Never seen anything like it." Henrik squinted, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene. He looked at the horse, whose posture was still one of high alert, and then at the stable, which stood silent and impassive. "He looks spooked clean through," Henrik observed. He pushed open the truck door, groaning softly as he swung his lanky frame out. He walked towards Thunder, his movements slow and deliberate. The horse watched him, but the epicenter of his fear remained the barn. "Ain't a wolf or a cat around, is there?" Henrik asked, his gaze scanning the low scrub brush that bordered the property. "Not that I can see or smell," Caleb replied. "Check the barn from top to bottom. Nothing. Not a snake, not a hornet's nest, nothing." Henrik stopped a respectful distance from the horse and folded his arms. He chewed on his lower lip, a thoughtful, deliberate motion. "Animals. They got senses we've forgotten how to use," he said, more to the sky than to Caleb. "They feel things, changes in the air, wrongness in the ground. My granddad used to say a horse can see the wind and smell a lie." Caleb, a man who believed in what he could hold and fix, felt a prickle of impatience. "It's a building, Henrik, made of wood and nails. I built it. There's no wrongness in it." "You built it, sure," Henrik conceded, nodding. "But the ground it's on? That's older than you, older than me, older than the first fence post ever sunk in this valley. You don't know its whole story." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Caleb looked from the terrified horse to the familiar structure of the stable. He knew every joint, every beam. He'd cut them, shaped them, fitted them. The idea that it could hold a story he didn't know felt like a personal affront. But the evidence of Thunder's terror was irrefutable. Just then, Elena's ATV crested the nearby rise, buzzing like an angry hornet before she cut the engine and coasted down the slope. She ran the ranch to the east, a tough, sharp-eyed woman who'd inherited the land and ran it with twice the efficiency of her father. She pulled her goggles up onto her forehead, her gaze immediately assessing the situation. "Heard the ruckus," she said, her voice clear and direct. "What's with your stud? He looks like he's seen a ghost." "Trying to tell him there's no such thing," Caleb grumbled. Elena swung her leg over the seat and walked closer, her eyes missing nothing. She didn't look at the horse first. She looked at the stable. "It's not just him," she said, her voice dropping a little. "Look." Caleb followed her gaze. The flock of chickens that usually scratched and pecked around the entire yard had congregated near the ranch house, a good 50 yards away, giving the stable a wide berth. The two barn cats, feral and fearless hunters, were not slinking in the shadows of the eaves as they usually did at this time of day. One was perched on the railing of the porch, the other was a ginger smudge under Henrik's truck. Even Caleb's dogs, Blue and Riley, who had been lounging by the back door, were sitting up, whining softly, their ears flat against their heads as they stared towards the barn. A collective, silent consensus had formed among the animals. That place was to be avoided. Henrik nodded slowly. See, they all feel it. Something's not right over there. Caleb's practicality was at war with the mounting evidence before his eyes. It was one thing for a single horse to be spooked. It was another for every creature on his property to engage in a synchronized act of avoidance. The seed of doubt Henrik had planted began to germinate in the fertile ground of this shared animal instinct. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The problem wasn't in his horse's head. It was in his barn. He left Henrik and Elena by the trucks and walked back towards the stable, this time not as its owner, but as an investigator. He moved with a new sense of purpose, his eyes narrowed, scrutinizing the structure he thought he knew so well. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn pine siding. It was solid, warm from the day's sun. He stepped just inside the doorway, into the threshold of shadow. The air was still and thick. He took a deep breath. Hay, earth, manure, wood. The normal smells. But was there something else? An undertone, faint and cloying, like damp soil in a place that should be dry? He dismissed it as imagination. He walked the length of the central aisle. 10 stalls, 5 on each side. He'd built it to be perfectly symmetrical. He stopped at the far end, by the back wall. This was the wall that faced the untamed expanse of the back acreage. He'd made it the thickest, reinforced to brace against the fierce winter winds that howled down from the mountains. He looked at the stall on his right, the last one. Thunder's stall. The one the horse now feared more than anything. It looked identical to the others. The wooden partition walls were solid. The packed earth floor was level. But as he stood there, a strange sense of dimensional wrongness pricked at the edge of his perception. It was a feeling, not a thought, an intuitive hiccup. He paced the width of the central aisle, his boot heels making soft thuds on the dirt floor. Then he paced the interior of the empty stall next to Thunder's. He had a good internal sense of measurement, honed by years of carpentry. He walked back out and paced the width of Thunder's stall. He stopped. He did it again, more slowly this time. It was shorter. The stall was not as deep as the one next to it, by at least 3 feet. His mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Had he framed it wrong all those years ago? Impossible. He was meticulous. He'd measured twice and cut once for this entire project. It was his masterpiece, the first major structure he'd completed on the ranch. He would have known. He would have seen it every single day. He pressed his hands flat against the back wall of the stall. It was planked with thick, vertical boards of pine, just like all the others. Solid. He pressed harder, leaning his weight into it. It didn't give. But his rational mind was now fully engaged with the anomaly. If the stall was 3 feet shorter on the inside, but the exterior of the building was a straight line, then there had to be a space behind this wall, a 3-foot-deep void. He balled his hand into a fist and knocked. The sound was not the dull, solid thud he expected. It wasn't the sound of a fist on thick pine backed by more framing and siding. It was a hollow, resonant boom that seemed to swallow the quiet of the stable. Thump, thump. The sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence. It was the sound of a drum, the sound of a lie, the sound of a secret kept by wood and nails. Outside, Thunder let out a sharp, terrified whinny, as if the knock had confirmed his deepest fears. Caleb's own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the hollow echo. He stood frozen in the dimming light, his knuckles pressed against the wall he had built, a wall that was now utterly alien to him. The solid world he had constructed with his own 2 hands had just revealed its first, terrifying secret, and the only question now was whether he had the courage to tear it open. The sun had finally surrendered, leaving a bruised, violet twilight in its wake. The air grew cold with a suddenness that felt predatory. Elena had switched on the headlights of her ATV, casting two sharp cones of white that cut through the gloom and made the shadows dance. Henrik's truck idled, a low, rumbling heartbeat in the unnerving quiet. They watched Caleb from a distance, respecting the invisible perimeter he had drawn around himself and the tainted structure. Caleb stood in the stall, his hand still resting on the hollow wall, the phantom vibration still tingling in his knuckles. His mind, usually a well-ordered workshop of practical thoughts, was a chaotic storm, a void, a 3-foot void behind a wall he had built. He tried to reason it away. A mistaken construction, a forgotten crawl space for insulation he'd never installed. No, he would have remembered. Every nail, every cut was seared into his memory. This space was not his creation. It was an inheritance he hadn't known he'd received. He backed out of the stall, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. The hollow sound still hung in the air, a question that demanded an answer. He looked out the wide doors to where his two neighbors stood, their silhouettes dark against the ATV's lights. He saw Thunder, a larger, more agitated shadow, still pacing, still held captive by his terror. The horse knew. The horse had known all along. Henrik's words about animal senses, about a wrongness in the ground, no longer sounded like folksy superstition. They sounded like the plain, unvarnished truth. A decision began to form, solidifying from the morass of his confusion. It felt less like a choice and more like a grim necessity, an inevitable conclusion to a day that had torn a hole in the fabric of his life. He could board up the stall, leave it empty, try to forget. He could try to coax his animals back into a routine, pretend the hollow sound was a trick of acoustics, an anomaly he could ignore. But he knew he couldn't. The knowledge of that empty space would fester, the wrongness would remain. Every time he looked at the stable, he would hear that resonant boom. Every time he looked at his horse, he would see the memory of this terror. The only way forward was through. He walked out of the stable and into the cool night air, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't look at Henrik or Elena. He walked past them, his stride long and determined, towards the small workshop adjacent to the ranch house. The dogs, Blue and Riley, whined and pressed against his legs as he passed, sensing the shift in his demeanor from confusion to a cold, hard resolve. Inside the workshop, the smell of sawdust, oil, and metal was a comfort, a reminder of the world of logic and tangible problems. He flicked on the single bare bulb that hung from a cord, casting a stark yellow light over his workbench. His tools lay in neat, orderly rows, instruments of creation and repair. His gaze fell upon a long, heavy crowbar, its steel clawed and scarred from years of prying stubborn rocks and splitting old fence posts. It was a tool of leverage, of brute force, a tool of deconstruction. He picked it up. The cold, solid weight of it in his hands was both a comfort and a violation. He was about to use a tool of building to unbuild. He was about to commit an act of violence against his own creation, to peel back a layer of the life he had so carefully constructed. The act felt irreversible, a step across a threshold from which there would be no return. The stable was a symbol of his hard work, his self-sufficiency. Breaking it open felt like breaking a part of himself. When he walked back out, the crowbar held loosely in his hand, Henrik and Elena were waiting. Marcus, one of the seasonal hands who lived in a small bunkhouse down the road, had arrived, drawn by the unusual gathering. He was a young, strong man, his face etched with concern. "Caleb, everything all right?" Marcus asked. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He walked back towards the stable, the crowbar a pendulum at his side. "There's a false wall," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "In the back of Thunder's stall, it's hollow." Henrik's weathered face tightened. Elena's sharp eyes widened slightly. They understood the implication. This was no longer about a spooked horse. "You're going to open it?" Elena asked, her voice quiet. "Have to," Caleb said, without stopping. He reached the stable entrance and paused, looking back at them. The light from the ATV caught the steel of the crowbar. "I need to know." He stepped inside. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant. They brought with them a lantern Elena had lit, its warm, flickering glow pushing back the deep shadows in the corners. The atmosphere inside was thick with anticipation. Caleb walked to the back stall, the place of wrongness. He handed the lantern to Marcus. "Hold this steady," he commanded. He faced the wall, his wall. He could see the faint lines where the pine boards met, the pattern of the nails he had hammered in himself. He ran his hand over it one last time, a strange, silent apology. Then he jammed the forked end of the crowbar into the seam between two boards. He took a deep breath, the air thin and tight in his lungs, and threw his weight into it. The wood groaned in protest. The shriek of nails being torn from their 8-year slumber was a sound of agony. With a sharp crack, the first board splintered and pulled away from the frame. A smell billowed out from the newly created gap. It was not the simple scent of old wood or trapped air. It was a thick, musty, organic stench. The smell of a root cellar, of damp earth, of decay. The smell of a long, undisturbed space, of time itself rotting. It hit him in the back of the throat, a gagging, cloying odor that spoke of things left in the dark for far too long. Elena gasped behind him. Henrik muttered a soft curse. Caleb ignored them. He was a man possessed by a singular, terrible purpose. He worked the crowbar again, with more force this time. Another board came loose, then another. He worked with a grim, rhythmic efficiency, his muscles straining, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Splintered wood fell to the dirt floor. The hole grew larger, a dark, gaping mouth in the back of the stall. When the opening was wide enough to see through, he stopped, breathing heavily. He took the lantern from Marcus, whose hand was trembling slightly. Caleb held it up to the breach. The lantern light pierced the darkness, revealing what lay beyond. It was not a simple void or crawl space. It was a chamber. The walls were not wood, but rough-hewn stone, crudely mortared. It was man-made, a deliberate construction hidden within his own. The air inside seemed to shimmer, thick with ancient dust, and on the stone wall directly opposite the opening, illuminated in the unsteady glow of the lantern, were scratches. He leaned closer, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. They weren't random marks. They were carvings, desperate and faded, scratched into the rock with a nail or perhaps a stone. A frantic tally of lines, like a prisoner marking the days. And below them, words, faint, almost illegible, but undeniable. HELPME. The plea echoed across 2 decades of silence, a scream trapped in stone. The stable was no longer a symbol of his hard work. It was a lie, and he had just broken it open, letting its horrific, suffocating truth into the light. The world seemed to contract to the size of the lantern's glow. The smell from the chamber was overwhelming now, a putrid combination of stagnant air and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, the scent of finality. Behind him, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from Elena, a choked sound from Marcus. Henrik was utterly silent. Caleb himself felt nothing but a strange, icy calm, the kind that descends when the worst thing you can imagine is about to be confirmed. He pushed away another splintered board, widening the opening until he could fit his shoulders through. "Caleb, maybe you should wait." Henrik's voice was a low warning. "Maybe we call the sheriff now." "I have to see," Caleb said, his own voice sounding distant, disconnected. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a witness. He was the end of a story he never knew he was a part of. He pushed the lantern ahead of him into the darkness, the light sliding over the rough stone floor. The chamber was small, no more than 6 feet deep and perhaps 8 feet wide. A cage of stone hidden within a shell of wood. The carvings were a testament to a long and desperate passage of time. His gaze followed the beam of light as it swept across the floor, past scattered debris that might have been scraps of cloth, and into the far left corner. And there it was. Curled in on itself, in a fetal position as if trying to find warmth or comfort in its final moments, was a shape. It was draped in the rotted, earth-stained remnants of what might have been a dress or a blanket. Protruding from the fabric were the unmistakable, pale and graceful curves of bone. A human skeleton. The skull was partially obscured, tucked down toward a cage of ribs. A small, delicate hand lay near where the face would have been. Time stopped. The sound of his own breathing, the shuffling feet of his neighbors, the distant whine of the wind. It all ceased. There was only the silent, screaming testimony of the bones in the lantern light. The stable he had built, the place he had sheltered his animals, the symbol of his quiet, ordered life, was a tomb. The wrongness that Thunder had sensed was not a vague feeling. It was this: the profound and absolute desecration of a human life, sealed away just feet from where he had worked and lived for nearly a decade. His hand trembled, making the lantern light dance over the scene, a macabre disco on the edge of a grave. He had to be sure. He had to make it real, to drag it from the realm of nightmare into the harsh light of fact. He crouched lower, leaning further into the opening, the foul air clinging to him like a shroud. His eyes fixed on something small and dark nestled amongst the bones of the neck and collarbone, a chain. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, he reached in. His fingers, calloused and thick from ranch work, fumbled with the object. It was cold, metallic. He drew it out into the light of the stall. It was a silver locket, heart-shaped, tarnished almost black with age and proximity to decay. The chain was delicate, impossibly so. He pressed the tiny clasp with his thumbnail. It resisted for a moment, then sprang open with a faint click. Inside, protected from the ravages of the chamber, were two miniature, faded photographs. On one side, a smiling older couple. On the other, a young woman with dark hair and bright, hopeful eyes. On the inside of the cover, beneath the woman's picture, a tiny, elegant script was engraved. The tarnish made it difficult to read. Caleb angled it in the lantern light, rubbing the surface with his thumb. The letters emerged from the grime. Sarah Collins. The name struck him like a physical blow. Sarah Collins. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost that had haunted the valley for as long as he'd been here. The teacher from the next town over who had vanished without a trace one autumn afternoon, 22 years ago. Her car was found on the side of the highway, keys in the ignition. There were posters, searches, newspaper articles that faded from the front page to the back, and then into memory. A cold case. A local tragedy that had become a cautionary tale whispered to children. Sarah Collins, forgotten by most, but not by all. And she had been here, the entire time, screaming silently from behind a wall of stone and wood. Caleb backed out of the opening, his legs unsteady. He held the locket in his open palm as if it were a burning coal. He looked at Henrik, at Elena, at Marcus. Their faces were masks of horror, pale and shocked in the lantern's glow. "It's Sarah Collins," he whispered. The words felt like sacrilege. Elena put a hand to her mouth, her sharp composure finally shattering. Henrik took off his hat, holding it to his chest as if in church. The full weight of the discovery crashed down on Caleb. This wasn't his property anymore. It wasn't his stable. It was a crime scene. A 22-year-old crime scene he had unknowingly been living beside. He stumbled out of the barn into the clean, cold air of the night. The light from the ATV seemed painfully bright. He felt the need to get away from the structure, to put distance between himself and the horror it contained. He walked on unsteady legs toward the house, the locket still clutched in his hand. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on his back. He fumbled his phone from his pocket, his fingers clumsy and numb. He scrolled through his contacts, his gaze blurry, until he found the number. Sheriff Clayton Morse. The call was short, the words stripped to their bare, horrifying essentials. "Clayt, it's Caleb Thorne. You need to get out to my place. Now. I found her. I found Sarah Collins." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with disbelief, before the sheriff's voice, suddenly sharp and all business, crackled back. "Stay right there, Caleb. Don't touch anything else. We're on our way. Caleb ended the call and stood looking at his house, the lights on inside painting warm, inviting squares in the darkness. It looked like a home. It had felt like a home. But now he knew it had been built on a foundation of secrets and violence. The peace he had worked so hard to create was an illusion, a thin veneer over a pit of unimaginable suffering. The first patrol car arrived in under 20 minutes, its siren a rising, mournful wail that tore the valley's tranquility to shreds. It was followed quickly by another, and then Sheriff Morse's own unmarked vehicle. Red and blue lights flashed across the yard, painting the ranch house, the workshop, and the faces of Caleb's neighbors in frantic, alternating colors. The strobing lights made the scene feel unreal, a nightmare projected onto the canvas of his life. Sheriff Morse, a stout, weary-looking man whom Caleb had known for years, stepped out of his car. His face, usually set in a look of mild exasperation with the world, was grim and focused. He took in the small group huddled near the house, the ATV lights still cutting through the darkness, and the gaping black maw of the stable. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and serious. "Talk to me. Start from the beginning." Leaning against the porch railing, the cold wood pressing into his back, Caleb recounted the day's events. He started with Thunder's terror, a detail that made the sheriff raise an eyebrow but not interrupt. He spoke of the other animals, of Henrik's words, of the feeling of wrongness, the discovery of the hollow wall. His voice was a monotone, a flat recitation of facts that felt entirely inadequate to convey the horror. He finished by describing the chamber, the bones, and the locket. He opened his hand and showed Morse the tarnished silver heart. The sheriff took it carefully, using a handkerchief from his pocket. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. 22 years, he murmured, to himself more than to Caleb. He then turned and began issuing orders to his deputies. The area was to be cordoned off, no one in or out. He called for the county coroner and the state investigation unit. Caleb's ranch was no longer his own. It was a jurisdiction. Yellow tape was stretched between fence posts and the side of the workshop, a lurid yellow scar across his property. It encircled the stable, turning it from a piece of his life into Exhibit A. Forensic technicians in sterile white coveralls arrived, carrying cases and equipment that seemed alien in the rustic setting. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their work illuminated by powerful, portable floodlights that bleached the color from the scene, making the shadows sharp and black. Caleb, Henrik, Elena, and Marcus were gently but firmly moved back towards the house, asked to give preliminary statements. Caleb felt detached, watching the invasion of his sanctuary as if from a great distance. He saw the technicians carefully documenting the splintered wood he had torn away, photographing the opening, preparing to enter the tomb he had uncovered. An hour bled into 2. The initial shock had given way to a thick, exhausting sorrow. Then another car pulled up the drive, this one moving slowly, cautiously. It was an old sedan, and Sheriff Morse himself went to meet it. When the passenger door opened, a small, frail figure emerged, leaning heavily on a cane. Even from the porch, Caleb could recognize her. It was Mrs. Collins, Sarah's mother. An elderly woman now, her back stooped with age and a grief that had never been allowed to rest. Sheriff Morse spoke to her gently, his large frame bent protectively over hers. Caleb couldn't hear the words, but he saw her body stiffen. He saw her lift her head, her gaze locking onto the brightly lit, now infamous stable. A sound carried across the yard, a thin, wounded cry that seemed to pull all the air from Caleb's lungs. It was the sound of a question that had festered for 2 decades, finally receiving its unbearable answer. Supported by the sheriff, she began to walk slowly towards the yellow tape. A deputy tried to stop her, but Morse waved him off. She had a right. Her pilgrimage ended at the boundary of the crime scene. She stood there, a tiny, black-clad figure, staring at the place where her daughter's life had ended. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. Caleb couldn't watch anymore. He turned away. The image of her grief burned into his mind. This was the consequence. This was the human cost of the secret his land had kept. The grim revelation wasn't just about bones in a wall. It was about this woman who had lived in a state of suspended agony for 22 years, only to find the most horrific closure imaginable on his doorstep. The piece of his property hadn't just been revealed as a tomb. It had been revealed as a source of unending active pain for a family he had never met. And now, standing on his own porch, surrounded by the flashing lights of a justice that had arrived 2 decades too late, Caleb felt like a trespasser in his own life. The days that followed were a blur of official procedure and quiet devastation. The state investigators worked meticulously, dismantling the hidden chamber stone by stone after the coroner had carefully removed Sarah's remains. They sifted through the packed earth of the stall, searching for any trace evidence the killer might have left behind. Caleb's ranch became a waypoint for grim-faced officials and news vans that parked at the end of his drive, their long lenses like vultures waiting for a story. He moved through it all in a fog, answering questions, signing papers, feeling the psychic weight of the discovery settle deeper into his bones. Sheriff Morse was relentless. The focus immediately fell on Jeremiah Slate, the man who had sold the ranch to Caleb 8 years ago. Slate had owned the property for 30 years before that, a brooding, reclusive figure who, according to Henrik, had kept to himself and harbored a simmering resentment for the world. He'd sold up and vanished, rumored to have moved to a remote corner of Montana. Slate built that stable 25 years back, Morse told Caleb one evening, standing by his truck as the forensic team packed up for the night. 3 years before Sarah Collins disappeared. The timeline fits. The sheriff's eyes were tired, but they held a hunter's glint. He was always a mean son of a bitch. People just thought he was a hermit. Turns out he was a monster hiding in plain sight. Finding Slate took less than a week. A paper trail of property taxes led them to a dilapidated cabin in a forgotten corner of the Bitterroot Mountains. When the Montana State Troopers and Sheriff Morse converged on the property, Slate didn't put up a fight. He was an old man now, stooped and withered, but his eyes, Morse later told Caleb, were as cold and empty as a winter sky. He confessed, not with remorse, but with a chilling matter-of-factness. Sarah's car had broken down on the highway near his turnoff. He'd offered her help, a ride to a phone. He'd brought her back to the ranch. When she'd rebuffed his advances, his malevolence had boiled over. He'd killed her in a fit of rage and, in a panic, had sealed her in the stone-lined space he'd inexplicably built into the stable, a tomb waiting for a body. He'd planked it over, finished the stall, and lived alongside his horrific secret for 3 more years before selling the land to Caleb and disappearing, confident his crime was buried forever. He hadn't counted on a horse. He hadn't counted on an animal's instinct being more perceptive than 2 decades of human investigation. Sarah Collins was finally given a proper burial in the small-town cemetery where she had grown up. The entire community turned out, a somber gathering under a sky the color of slate. Caleb went, standing at the back of the crowd, feeling like an intruder. He watched Mrs. Collins, supported by relatives, place a single white rose on her daughter's casket. Her face was a mask of ancient sorrow, but for the first time since Caleb had seen her, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Not peace, not yet, but the profound finality of closure. After the service, she sought him out. Her small, wrinkled hand found his. "Thank you," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "You gave her back to me. You let her rest." Caleb could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He hadn't done anything but listen to his horse. He was just the man who had owned the land where the truth had refused to stay buried. In the weeks after the funeral, the official presence on the ranch dwindled until only the yellow tape remained, faded and sagging, a tired reminder of the storm that had passed. But for Caleb, the place was irrevocably tainted. He couldn't look at the stable without seeing the ghost of that hidden chamber, without smelling the phantom stench of decay, without hearing the silent scream from the stones. Thunder still refused to go near it. The other animals continued to give it a wide, fearful berth. The wrongness lingered. There was only one thing to do. He started one crisp autumn morning, with the crowbar once again in his hand. But this time, it did not feel like a violation. It felt like a purification. He began to dismantle the stable, board by board. Marcus came to help, then Henrik, and even Elena, who showed up one afternoon with a thermos of coffee and a pair of work gloves. They didn't talk much. They just worked, their movements methodical, respectful. It was a deconstruction, but it felt like a sacred duty. They pulled down the walls, stacked the lumber, and exposed the dark, scarred earth where the stable had stood. When they got to the stone chamber, they dismantled it too, stone by heavy stone, until nothing remained but a shallow depression in the ground. Caleb filled it in with clean soil from another part of the ranch, burying the memory under fresh earth. He chose a new spot for the stable, on a gentle rise on the other side of the house, a place that caught the morning sun. The work was hard, the kind of labor that left his muscles aching and his mind clear. He used some of the old, untainted lumber, but most of it was new pine, its scent clean and sharp. As he built, he felt as though he was not just constructing a new building, but reconstructing his own peace. He was raising walls not to hide secrets, but to create sanctuary anew. He was driving nails not to seal a tomb, but to affirm life. This was the penance, the act of reclamation. Home, he was learning, was not a place you simply owned. It was a place that had to be earned, cleansed, and consciously made safe. The day the new stable was finished, the roof on, the stalls clean and filled with fresh hay, Caleb stood back and looked at his work. It was a good, honest structure, born not of a dark past, but of a conscious and hopeful future. He went to the pasture where Thunder was grazing. The horse lifted his head, his eyes soft and clear. Caleb clipped on the lead rope, and with a heart full of a quiet, fragile hope, began to walk him toward the new building. He didn't pull or coax. He simply walked, and the horse followed. They approached the wide, open doors of the new stable. Thunder's steps were calm, his ears relaxed. He sniffed the air, taking in the scent of fresh pine and clean hay. He paused at the threshold, just for a moment, and looked at Caleb. Then, without a flicker of hesitation or fear, he lowered his head and walked inside. He went directly to his new stall, pushed his nose into the hay feeder, and began to eat, his presence filling the space with a profound and reassuring calm. His terrible duty was done. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching him. A wave of exhaustion and relief so immense it was almost painful washed over him. The flashing lights were gone, the yellow tape was gone, the ghost was at rest. The land was quiet again. It wasn't the same easy, oblivious peace he had known before. This was a different kind of tranquility, a harder, more somber kind. It was the peace of a man who had looked into the abyss and had come back, forever changed. He had learned that the deepest secrets are buried just beneath the surface of the familiar, that instinct can speak a truth reason cannot grasp, and that justice, even when it arrives a lifetime late, has the power to cleanse the very ground beneath your feet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. It was a quiet, ordinary evening, but for Caleb Thorne, it was the first day of the rest of his hard-earned life. He had built his home, lost it, and now, one splinter and scar at a time, he had begun to build it again.